Studies Section 3, Instrument of Foreign Policy Implementation. Introduction. In this study session, we will examine the instrument of foreign policy implementation. Instruments of foreign policy are those mechanisms and means through which international actors try to achieve their foreign policy objectives. There are various types of instruments, namely diplomacy, economic instrument. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to analyze diplomacy as an instrument of foreign policy implementation, discuss the forms of economic instruments of foreign policy, analyze diplomacy as an instrument of foreign policy implementation, discuss psychological instruments used in foreign policy implementation, present international organizations as instruments of foreign policy. Instrument of diplomacy. Diplomacy may be defined as the management of international relations by bargaining and negotiation. It involves representation, arbitration, conciliation, and mediation. Most states maintain diplomatic representations of all kinds in other countries with which they are more or less on friendly terms. In fact, it can be said that diplomatic representation is an indication of the existence of a degree of cordiality between the host and the guest states. Diplomacy consists of two main components, ceremonial and protocol, and techniques and methods of negotiation. While the ceremonials involve close observance of certain formalities in the relationship among international actors, the protocol is a form of hierarchical order which is kept as an expression of defensive and good or polite conduct among state officials. The ceremonial and the protocol refer to the set of rules that ensure polite interactions and decorum in the diplomatic community. But on the other hand, the techniques and methods refer to the process of bargaining among states. Diplomacy today has gone beyond the traditional and exclusive role of representation. The diplomat in the field has lost over the years his policy-making status. This has been conditioned by the important factors of technological advancement. Improvements in transportation and communication technology have bridged the gap between states and have reduced the world into what is referred to as the global village. Technology, in other words, has increased the speed with which one state can communicate to one another and has therefore reduced the role being played by diplomats in the policy formulation. This is why today it is rare to find an ambassador This is why today it is rare to find an ambassador plenipotentiary which used to confer on diplomats autonomous powers to make policies of certain levels of importance on behalf of the state. Functions of diplomacy. Although diplomacy is essentially a government affair, non-governmental bodies also relate to one another across state frontiers using the basic instrument of diplomacy. Charitable organizations, revolutionary liberation movements maintain relations with one another to replicate in their form or mode the characteristics and procedures of international governmental relations. Whether practiced by governmental or quasi-governmental or non-governmental organizations, diplomacy has primarily four functions. 1. Protection of the national interest. 2. Representation of the national. This may be legal, symbolic, or social. 3. Observation and reporting on behalf of the state. 4. Negotiation, which is normally the simplest way of reconciling competing national interests. Apart from the diplomacy of representation, other forms of diplomacy have emerged particularly in the 20th century. Two of the noticeable forms are conference diplomacy conducted essentially through international organizations such as UN, AU, Arab League, as well as through specific technical conferences either of a bilateral or a multilateral nature, e.g., the Law of the Sea Conference. The second new form is summit diplomacy. This is negotiation and representation at the highest level of government, often involving the chief executive of the state. This is noticeable in the direct exchange of visits among heads of states. Summit diplomacy may be bilateral, involving two, or multilateral, involving three or more. One of its advantages is that it allows for quick resolution of issues since it involves the highest approving authorities in the state represented. Diplomacy forms the bulk of state-to-state relations. As a result, those countries that are skilled in diplomatic relations usually have their ways even before the less skilled ones realize it. Trade. Trade is the most noticeable and the most widely used instrument of an economic nature. The world today is a network of exchanges of goods and services, and it is valid to say that we live in an interdependent world in which hardly any nation can be said to be totally independent of any nature in respect of its national needs. This interdependence puts in the hands of states a major weapon with which they can manipulate other states to attain desired policy objectives. The main buyer of a country's produce can be manipulated by the suppliers for the purpose of attaining the latter's policy objectives. The former also can manipulate the latter where the former has alternative sources of supply. The former can therefore get the latter to adopt policies which are beneficial to the former policy objectives. The normal processes of trade encourage friendship among states. Hence, states are perpetually involved in promoting trade and sorting out motions arising from such exchanges. Foreign direct investment, FDI. Another important type of economic instrument is foreign direct investment, FDI. The era of transnational and multinational corporations has been characterized with the politics of finance capital in which domestic and foreign policies of investment-seeking countries must take up the interest of foreign investors. The foreign policy challenge of Nigeria since the return to civil rule in 1999 has been how to attract foreign investors. In fact, less developed countries usually compete among themselves in their effort to attract foreign investors, and this limits the foreign policy options for these states. Closely related to foreign direct investment is the use of loans and aids in the policies of international lending and assistance. Most of the borrowing countries, including Nigeria, have been battling with the syndrome of highly indebted status. The Fourth Republic administration of President Olusegun Obasanjo succeeded in securing some debt forgiveness for the Nigeria after a lot of diplomatic commitment, national rebranding, and image laundering in what was called economic diplomacy. Other forms of economic instruments are tariff, currency manipulation, quota, boycott, embargo, blockade, exclusion, and sabotage. Most of these can be used positively or negatively, while some are basically negative in their image. One unique feature of the economic instrument of policy is its flexibility and maneuverability. It can be used almost simultaneously to reward one state and punish another. It is capable of being used in both peace and war times, symbolically serving as a double-edged sword. The economic instrument is also useful and often used in war situations as states at war are known to engage in activities which are intended to undermine the economic capabilities of their enemies and hence reduce the enemy's capabilities. Psychological instrument. The psychological instrument comprises of the various attempts and means by which governments reach the minds and emotions of people in other states. It may be regarded as soft power. Basically, the psychological instruments are used to appeal to people rather than government, though the ultimate intent is to get a change of policy on the part of government by using their people as the pressure point. One of the most used psychological instruments is propaganda. Propaganda is basically a verbal instrument that is articulated in words, and it is the systematic method of influencing the minds and emotions for a specific purpose. Propaganda is often selfish because it is intended primarily to help the propagandist to attain its policy objectives. Propaganda is conducted through various means, the most important of which are the radio waves, particularly the shortwave radio, which has become as ubiquitous as the world's airwaves. Most states today maintain external broadcasting services such as Voice of America (VOA), British Broadcasting Corporation (BBC), external services (VON), Some of these stations are less explicit in their propaganda function than others. For example, the BBC and the VOA appear to give detailed information on world events, but for the most part, such information can be so doctored and so detailed as to undermine the credibility of the information supplied by domestic radio stations acting within the existing constraint of governmental censorship. Others, such as Radio Free Europe and the Voice of the Free Russia, were deliberately and unabashedly propagandist. They deliberately distort information to make their ideological points, which are intended to influence the minds and emotions of their target audience. A distinction is made in the literature today between informal penetration and informal access. Informal penetration is the forcible appeal to peoples over and above the consent of government using the instrumentality of the mass communication media. The informal access is the subtle appeal to people's emotions through cultural contact, exchange of ideas, and visits which may or may not have the approval of government and which hardly involves government. Military instrument. One important means of international relation is the use of force. From the realist point of view, military strength is an important element of national power and instrument of foreign policy. In the words of Clausewitz, war is a mere continuation of policy by other means, a real political instrument, a continuation of political commerce. However, experts in strategic studies have emphasized the usefulness of military instruments in both wartime and peacetime. This is seen in various acts of terrorism and the unconventional use of force. However, the impact of democracy on foreign policy has been to enhance the economic imperative and reduce the instrumentality of the military. Ekizona 1993, page 10. Prayers of the masses at home for increased economic well-being cause governments to go into the international system to seek growth through trade, commodity agreement, international investment, and capital flows. The tendency is to supplant military instrument with economic instrument. International organizations. International actors also use international organizations in the pursuit of their foreign policies. States join international organizations because they are useful to them. Nigeria used the ECOMOG under the ECOWAS framework to pursue a foreign principle of promoting peace and political stability in Africa. Also, Nigeria is an active member of the African Union (AU) because of a policy of promoting African unity. Nigeria also an active member of the United Nations and other world bodies because of a policy of promotion of world peace built on freedom, mutual respect, and equality for all peoples of the world. Members of Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries (OPEC) use the organization to protect their interests as petroleum exporting countries. Also, the developed Western countries are usually accused of using such international organizations as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund (IMF), and the World Trade Organizations (WTO, etc.) to continue to their policy of imperialism in the post-colonial era. Study section summary. In this study session, you learn that foreign policy is the mechanisms and means through which international actors try to achieve their foreign policy objectives. The realization of foreign policy objective depends largely on the effectiveness of the instrument employed. These instruments include instruments of diplomacy, military instrument, economic instrument, and psychological instrument. States, howbeit, are not equally endowed with the resources of these instruments. Thus, states use the ones they can effectively deploy to maximize the advantage. These instruments are not used in isolation but are combined variously by different international actors. This is the end of study section 3. Thanks for listening.